So, Rob, you were in the hot seat in 2020, March 2020. Cast your mind back. How ready was Cornwall Council for the COVID pandemic?
I don't think that the health and social care system in an entirety was ready. If you remember, we were doing recruitment campaigns because there were hundreds of staff vacancies across the health and social care system. The A&E department was consistently full. The availability of beds was kind of pretty poor, really. So I think overall, the system was in no way prepared. It was struggling just to cope with the everyday demands, never mind the extra demands of the pandemic.
I mean, as Matt Hancock said in his evidence to the COVID inquiry the other day, there was a lot of emphasis on things like body bags. And I can remember doing stories about Cornwall Council scrabbling around to try to identify sites where bodies were going to need to be
Yes.
stored.
Yeah, I remember that. Yes.
A location at Newquay Airport.
That's right. And there were kind of maybe give an indication of the mindset that they had. Whereas kind of they were always kind of doing things like PPE, which was non-existent, and we were being rationed. They were sourcing supplies, and we were being rationed, and then we were being required to help out care homes because they didn't have any. And I remember really clearly being told, whatever cost you incur, we'll kind of support them. So okay, that's really helpful, because the adult social care budget in Cornwall traditionally overspent year on year. Every year it overspent, and it was being bailed out by reserves and all that kind of stuff. So all of a sudden, then I had to sign an order off for PPE. So the price had gone through the roof. So what we would normally spend about this order should be about £500,000, was like 900,000. Because the cost had gone up. And then, of course, when we submitted our request for reimbursement, you're going to have to meet it, guys, from your budget. And I think that wasn't the deal, was it? And for me, that set the tone of the relationship between centre and kind of the outposts, as it were. Because if you remember, and I'm sure you do, the Green Paper restructuring adult social care, I don't know how many years, it's probably a decade out of date, but it never appeared. So we were waiting for that. The investment in Cornwall essentially had gone to the centre, i.e. Trelisk. Over the years, you can see that pattern of investment. So all the other supportive services had been starved of funding. And at Cornwall Council, we were given, you can add an extra 2% for adult social care. Well, that didn't even dent inflation, never mind growth or the backlog. So it was a very difficult time, and one that we were really not prepared for.
I mean, that relationship between central government and local government is absolutely pivotal, isn't it? When you looking back now 3 years later, nobody really knew what to do, and so you were looking to the centre for guidance. Was it guidance or was it instruction?
Well, I think there was a blend, really, and I think Cornwall's kind of a bit different because of its rurality. And if you remember, we did really, as a county, we did really well in terms of people paying attention to the guidance. I was putting guidance up all the time locally here for the guys in my patch, and a wider Cornwall about this is what you should be doing, this is what you should be doing. And if you remember, the infection rates in Cornwall, month in, month out, were way, way, way lower than anywhere else in the country. Maybe kind of Sillies was perhaps lower, but essentially we were lower than anyone else. And then the holiday period started, and kind of, it'd be a good idea if you stayed at home. But if you want to go on holiday, you can. But you can't go abroad. So let's think, where can you go on holiday? It's really quite nice. Oh, Cornwall's a really nice place. So all of a sudden, we had this massive influx of people from out of the county. And surprise, surprise, the infection rate went through the ceiling and really never recovered from that. So I think there could and should have been very clear, very firm direction about, look, stay at home. don't go on holidays. Just kind of if you all play by the rules, there's a notion. If we all play by the rules, then probably we'll be able to cap it and hold it, and then the vaccine program will roll out, etc.
I mean, that whole period when we were in, I can't remember which was the more dangerous tier to be in. We were either tier 1 or tier 4, but we were at the end, which was the safest, as you say. But you still had boundaries, didn't you? So you were somewhere, there would be a parish boundary where you were in the safe tier, and the other side of the river was in the dangerous side.
It's very different.
So pubs and restaurants could be open on one side, but not on the other.
Yes.
But
again, that I think that reflects the kind of the confusion or the lack of good interpretation of the rules and sort of applying them equally to everybody. And I know some people didn't believe in it, and some people didn't want to, and some people kind of rebel naturally. But I think if there'd been very clear instruction, not only to the people but to the police, etc., about what I remember that. Time and time again, listening to different interpretation from different police, not just different police forces, but different officers within Devon and Cornwall Police, for example, because there was that lack of clarity and certainty. So I think that comes back to centre. This is something that no one. I've been in this game all my life. I have never experienced anything quite like this. So everybody was in new territory. So you expect then to be given direction. You expect some flexibility, local circumstances, but you expect clarity, which never happened.
Within Cornwall Council, was there a sentiment that you should be doing more to lobby to be in the safe tier, to be protected? In other words, basically undermining the tourism sector, or were you under pressure to say, well, we rely on the tourists coming, and so we need to lift the restrictions and encourage more people to come here?
Dilemma! What a real dilemma! Because we all understood how important visitors are to the economy of Cornwall. Absolutely, our responsibility as cabinet was not to them. Our responsibility as cabinet and the leadership of the council at that time was to the people of Cornwall. So we were really clear and vociferous in saying, this is our job. These are our people. We must look after them first and foremost. Visitors are always welcome, but maybe not now. And I'm absolutely clear that we were making that message known, but the answers we got were still vague and woolly, and there was this kind of lack of direction, and then of course you get the increasing lack of confidence in the ability of centre to actually manage it.
Well, let's focus now on what Matt Hancock said the other day about this critical period when people were moving between residential care homes. So you've got vulnerable elderly people in care. Not surprisingly, they frequently need hospital attention, and if all goes well, they leave hospital and go back to the residential care home. Unfortunately, this is during a period when we didn't have adequate testing facilities. And so we didn't know whether they were carrying COVID or not. What advice or instruction did you feel that you were getting from central government, and how do you think that squares with what Matt Hancock said the other day?
Well, it doesn't square what he said. It doesn't. People were being discharged from hospital either without testing or testing, but the results weren't being shared with care homes. Fact. There's no question about it. And I have absolute clear recollection of at least one care home where there were a number of deaths. Now, whether they were directly attributable to a person being discharged with who's tested positive, but we know that was the case, that an individual was discharged to that care home, and their care home did not know that this person had tested positive, so they didn't take those extra precautions that you would take had you known that. So and that's just one illustration. But what I found fascinating and about Mr. Hancock's statement was the ring of steel around care homes. So that I got tired of hearing that phrase because I didn't see any evidence of it. But then if you say that and you repeat it, and then you say, we didn't know how many care homes we had, that doesn't chime, does it really? If you're saying we're putting a ring of steel around them, that means you know how many you've got, where they are, and you're protecting them. But then to say, as a department, we didn't even know how many care homes we got. But in itself, that's not true either, is it? Because the Care Quality Commission is a government body which regulates care homes, how many beds, how many. So you know, you have layer upon layer of untruths from this person who was in charge. So if you have this situation where you know that the person in charge and directing the strategy, etc., is not telling the truth, it makes life increasingly difficult to do the job we were doing. But all the time, our focus, and I remember my colleague in running children's services, was about, we hear that music coming from centre, but we're going to do what we believe to be the right thing.
Well, how could you do things differently now? If a new coronavirus, a new variant, were to emerge, and our vaccines were proven to be ineffective, and heaven forbid you were back in the cabinet and running things in that department, how would you do things differently, knowing that you can't rely on the centre?
It would be very difficult because so much of the direction, for example, you know, we know that if there was an international hotspot where people, you know, new variants had been developed, which was particularly virulent, but flights from that country were still coming in. So it would be very difficult. You know, we can't close the borders to Cornwall, which, quite frankly, I thought that was an interesting notion at one point. That just stop people. Look, just stop.
Was there ever any serious discussion about closing the border?
I don't think so. No, it's quite a challenge, wasn't it? Because, you know, because of tourism being so important to the economy, then the people who are at the top end or are making decisions about tourism, they were pushing, because, you know, businesses were going out, shops, pubs, restaurants were going out of business. So I get that. But at the same time, how do you balance this? For me, it's dead easy. How do you balance it between businesses really struggling and people dying? It's a no-brainer. You do whatever it is you've got to do to make sure that you protect people. You know, the economy at some point will recover.
There have been some academic studies that have shown that the Eat Out to Help Out scheme that Rishi Sunak introduced when he was Chancellor actually resulted in additional deaths. Yes. And
inevitably
encouraging people to go out for meals may have saved the high street, but killed people.
Well, I think, you know, I'm not a businessman. You know, I don't run a business, but I understand the stresses, and so I know businesses locally who struggled. I get that, but for me, it's a simple choice. You know, do you focus on kind of saving people? And let's not be over dramatic, but let's tell it as it is. People were dying. So how do you balance, or how do you reconcile a pub closing because there's nobody eating or drinking there with people dying? You know, for any right-minded individual, and I'm not unsympathetic to business, but for me, every time you would invest that money in making sure people that survived, lived, and so many of them were abandoned.
Now, the Cornwall Council, of course, owns Newquay Airport, and there were flights coming in, and the airport management was encouraging. Not surprisingly, they wanted to keep going as a business. Did the council ever consider closing the airport?
I think it's an interesting notion, and I understand where you're coming from, but of course Newquay Airport is a separate entity, so the influence, I think, that and I'm not an expert in this particular aspect, but I think the influence that the council can exert on the airport, because it operates as a separate entity.
Yeah, well, it gives it nearly
sensitive.
Yeah, I know, but it gives it nearly £4 million a year. That's quite an influence.
And I think it could, in reality, then you're right. In reality, then I guess, and that's not my expertise.
I-
They could have been told no.
Yeah,
Stop.
but I mean, you just said though it's a no-brainer. You know, if it's a choice between the business or saving somebody's
Yeah.
life, well, the council itself could not be seen to be blameless.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think I inherited an adult social care system that was under massive strain, and this is not new, and I've said it repeatedly. It was under strain. So the council was doing, and let me tell you, I had some phenomenal battles with accountants and finance people about making sure that we're doing the right thing, where we're putting money in the right place. But the challenge, of course, was that there probably was never going to be enough money. The council didn't have enough money to do all the things it should do. And certainly I was battling against the other departments because they were putting the same kind of arguments I was, we need to do this. Because the difference with Cornwall is there was inward migration was increasing, longevity, people were living longer. They weren't necessarily living longer well. So every year on year, the strains on the adult social care budget was growing exponentially, and there wasn't the money. So we never got to the point of rationing. But then you look very closely at what do we have to do, what we don't have to do. So I think the council was in a very, very difficult position. Could it have made some decisions differently? In hindsight, yes, I think.
Well, one of those I'd like to ask you about. You were out of office, but only by a few months when this happened. The G7 summit.
Yeah.
Now, Cornwall did still have really very low levels of COVID compared with the rest of the country until the G7. And then almost within days, we started to see an exponential increase, particularly in those towns associated with the summit. And the official line from County Hall was, "Oh, this is a different variant. It's not the bog standard one that we had before, and so it's not as a result of the G7." Not a lot of people believe that.
Well, and not surprising, really. Do you know? I don't want to play a semantic game about what variant might be. Okay, so we were in a pandemic, okay, and people were losing their lives in this pandemic. So to then have this event, which any other time I would have been a number one supporter of, casting spotlight on Cornwall, always a good thing. Maybe bringing investment, did all these kind of things. I would normally say, yeah, I'll give my support to that. At this time, it was fun. I think the thinking rate was fundamentally flawed. Should not have happened. Or it should have happened, but go somewhere else. Hold it in London, or because they hold this stuff in like big cities. But Cornwall was fragile, and holding the G7 was kind of, eating into that fragility even more. And of course, and I can say this now, I look back and say, what was the benefit of G7? In Cornwall, where are the things that are better now, directly attributable to G7, that weren't there before? And I struggle to see that.
Well, we've got the Chronosat satellite that's still looking for a rocket to take it into space. And we've got some electric bikes.
Yeah. Well, absolutely.
I can't think of anything else. Actually.
And here in North Cornwall, because we weren't affected by, the diversions and traffic and all this kind of stuff. But here in North Cornwall, what was the impact of having that? The positive impact, I can't see it. What was the negative impact? The infection rates went through the ceiling again. And we got a handle on it.
One of the biggest impacts of the whole thing was on the way we do government. Because local government initially was really shut down. Most of the rest of the country, though, did go back to holding face-to-face meetings or online meetings by April of 2020, but not Cornwall. In fact, Cornwall was one of the last to go back to having committee meetings and scrutinising the work of the executive. Do you think that was the right approach, or could Cornwall have restored democracy a little bit sooner?
I think it could have done that. Was there the will to do that? That's a question for me. But I mean,
Well, how do you answer that question then?
I don't know really. It's quite hard. I know that I was working from home for 2 years and with no support, zero support. So at least when you are going into an office, you've got all the kind of all the peripheral stuff that keeps you going. But there was none of that. So imagine we're in a unique situation. Unique. No one had experienced anything quite like it since, I don't know, kind of history, the Great Plague and things like this. We got technology so we could talk to each other, but there was actually no support. So you're sat at the dining room table or in your office or whatever it is, working away with no support. And the support of colleagues, I've always been in teams. All my life I've worked in a team. And there's a strength that you gain from being in a team. But this wasn't there. So even more difficult. And just trying to gather information was a constant channel, and the pressure all the time. Press wanted to talk to you, wanted answers. You got people in the street stopping me and saying, "What are we doing about this? What's happening here?" So I think it's very, very difficult. Could it have been brought together quicker? Yeah, I think, and it could, and it should have.
I mean, in many respects, that has still not gone back to normal. Indeed, the lessons from COVID, one of them being portrayed really as a positive, is that it's quite possible to work from home and that there's no need to come into the office. Particularly if you're one of the senior council officers, you can work from home, and as a result, we're now able to close offices and sell them to realise those capital receipts.
Yeah,
win-win-win.
Yeah,
at least that's the official line.
Sort of. And I get that, and I think. Sometimes you have to go through this kind of like fall off the edge of a cliff before you can think, oh, maybe we could do it differently. So I think that there is an element of merit in allowing people to work from home. I think there's an element of merit in that. There's a balance of that. And I know, for example, one of the big things for my team when during the pandemic was that lack of support. People feeling isolated, their workload, and I can't praise the people, and it's I wasn't a fan of clapping for care, for goodness sakes, let's be real, let's pay them properly, let's treat them decently, let's make sure their terms and conditions of service are right and proper, so that people want to come in. Let's create a career structure. Let's do all those things which we are working on, week in, week out. We are working on those things, and then kind of to put them in, I don't know, exponentially a higher level of stress than they've ever been in. So what I was beginning to see, for example, was the sickness rate within my team was creeping up. Because they were picking up infection, yes. Burnout, yes. No days off, holidays being cancelled, can't get away. Working in care homes where there's infection, so they can't go home because they've got children. Okay, so they're actually waving to their children through the house window, then going back and dealing with people who are dying because of this infection. So I saw a greater sickness absence level than I'd experienced, not only here but kind of previously in my career in the health and social care system. So, and I don't think we've recovered from that now. And I talked to people who. On Saturday, it was a Maisie Day, and I met someone who worked for me at that time, and they gave it up, and they said, it was always, I always felt honoured to do the job, I felt I was really contributing, but that kind of blew me out of the water, and ultimately I couldn't cope with it, so I got out. So good people got out. So maybe, despite all the kind of efforts, we're in a worse position now maybe than we were before.
We now have a vaccine which has got the whole thing under control, and indeed globally it's no longer deemed to be the threat that it was. What lessons do you think could be learnt? Is to your knowledge, is Cornwall giving evidence to the COVID inquiry?
I don't know.
You don't feel that you've got something to say as a witness?
I would, if someone asked me, like you did, if someone asked me to give evidence, I would absolutely do that, because I still feel passionate about it, as passionate today as I did 2 years ago or whatever it was, or 4 years ago when it all kicked off. So I don't know, but I'm out of the loop now. So I don't know if Cornwall was asked. It should have been, because for so long we were doing so very, very well.
I mean, I think a lot of people would agree with you that Cornwall should have a key role, really, and a story to tell to the COVID inquiry because of the peripherality.
Yeah.
And as you say, starting off with so many people shielding, high uptake of mask wearing when masks became available, and so on, rigorous testing as soon as people were able to get tested, and so on. And then it all went to pot, and we saw towns like Newquay and other tourism hotspots recording record levels of infection.
And we were being creative as well, you know. I mean, I remember signing contracts for hotels because hotels had shut. Yep. And I remember signing up 3 contracts. 2 we used and 1 we had in reserve because there were no beds. You know, the capacity, the number of beds at Trellisk had to be reduced, obviously because of space and all that staffing. So we were using hotels. So they did the kind of hotel bit and we put care in. So we did things like that. We were the first to do that. And then other people picked that up. So there are things that we were doing that other people weren't doing. You know, and then, you know, for example, you see the mobile hospital in Exeter. And you know, if you've been in the game as long as I have, you put your head in your hands and you just think, oh my goodness me. And I remember watching it on the TV, and the few people who were going to be running it were really excited and optimistic. And I'm thinking, where are the staff coming from? You know, simple.
But at that time, wasn't Cornwall lobbying that we wanted a Nightingale hospital? Well, we wanted one on our side of the Tamar.
We want more. We need more beds. But then, you know, shipping people to Exeter, right? Imagine living in Penzance. I remember when Trellisk, we had an incident at Trellisk where it was just swamped. And it had gone on from the night before, and that normal kind of where it is off during the night hadn't happened. So, you know, 8 a.m. or 7:30 in the morning, it's as bad as it was the evening before. And we were kind of said, okay, the decision is then, NHS had never experienced anything quite like it. And so they said, okay, so divert ambulances away from Trellisk. So ambulances were diverted away to Doriford, RD&E and Barnstable, North Devon, who at the same time were experiencing the same things. So potentially then, if you had whatever it was in Penzance, you're going to be shipped to hospitals an hour and a half to 2 hours away from home, who still couldn't cope with you. So that was a reality of kind of like where we were. So anything that would help us, people were kind of grasping at straws to an extent, because this was outside. I'd never experienced anything like it, and I've kind of, you know, I was in part of the planning team, the government task force planning for the Gulf War, the first Gulf War. So I was used to kind of like, you know, thinking outside the box and big catastrophe type stuff. But this exceeded anything that I'd ever experienced before. So I think it's a real challenge. And again, people were grasping at straws. It might help. But then when you look at it, you think, all those beds, we haven't got enough, we're losing care staff. We haven't got enough, we can't man the care homes we got. We can't man the hospitals with beds we got. You know, the hotels that I was putting in, the care we were putting in was peripatetic. So it wasn't permanent. They were going in to do stuff and then coming out again. So having, you know, but it, you know, it's kind of, you know, come back to Mr. Hancock, bless him, you know, saying, look what I'm doing this. And it's headline stuff. That's what it was. There was no substance to it. It was all headline stuff. And those people within the system could see that's what it was. Showboating.
I can remember one of the ministerial briefings led by Matt Hancock, and the mood of the nation afterwards seemed to be, thank God, he's the grown up in the room. Yeah. He's the hero. He's wearing a little green badge that says care, and he's announcing a testing regime, and it looks like somebody's finally getting a grip. With hindsight, what do you think about Matt Hancock now?
Oh, goodness me. Well, I think, knowing what we all know now about the things that went on in terms of PPE and contracts and companies that didn't exist or that had no previous experience in managing or sourcing PPE, and how contracts are dished out, VIP lanes, all that kind of stuff. I'm angry about it because they were playing with people's lives, and we could have done so much more. Millions of pounds worth of PPE that wasn't fit for purpose, and and it's disappeared. We don't know where it is, and then I'm signing a contract off for £900,000 worth of PPE, which was of the right quality, but I hadn't got £900,000.